Chapter 17. The End. Phaedrus stared down at his mother, lying there on her bed. She had pulled the covers over her head, so ashamed of her pain. One wrinkled hand clutched at a corner of the white sheet. When they were fleeing the destruction of Mardal, hiding from Dalek patrols, she huddled him in her cloak and told him old Greek stories. "I wanted to explain," the priest began, his hands folded in front of him. "I had to reset the matrix to get me here. I suppose it's an indulgence of the Hootai, letting me live this long. I wanted to talk to you. I can now. I've finally done it. Death has come crashing down on them. They can feel what I've always felt. Death is with us all now." Audrey threw back the covers and sat up. "What are you talking about?" she asked, and startled Phaedrus. Behind the priest, a door opened. Phaedrus turned as Ace ran at him, raised his arm to fend off the blow. She hit him in the stomach, ramming her bunched fist hard into him. He fell to his knees, gasping. Ace looked down at him, and their eyes met. He seemed to be pleading. She kicked at his jaw. The toe of her boot caught the man in the soft flesh of his throat. He tried to scream as he hit the ground, and it came out as a choked howl. Ace was trying to feel something. This was what put meaning into Jan's death. This revenge. Phaedrus had rolled into a fetal ball, an instinctive motion to protect his internal organs. "Don't!" he gasped. "Don't!" He sounded like a child. Ace hadn't looked at anything but her enemy since she entered the room. The place had been obvious in pewter space, beckoning her with an open door. She just run straight in and found Phaedrus. Now she felt a familiar lean strength grab her shoulders. The arms encircled her and pulled her back. It was the actions of somebody who wasn't used to violence, who was driven to it by passion. "Leave him alone," hissed Audrey, furiously. "My God, I didn't bring you up to be like this." "You didn't bring me up at all," screamed Ace, smashing her mother against the wall. "You didn't! You didn't!" She was yelling into her face now, shaking her by the collar. "Where were you? Where were you when he died? Oh, my poor baby, my poor baby. You're dead! Everybody's dead!" As Ace's attack grew more frenzied, her mother didn't try to protect her. Instead of putting her arms up to shield herself from her child's blows, Audrey simply let her grip on Ace's shoulders grow tighter. Audrey was wincing as she was shaken, sobs welling up from deep inside her. "Oh, my poor love," she sobbed. "My poor baby. I wanted to do everything for you. I wanted you to be happy. Everything's so screwed up, and I don't know how anything works anymore, and I'm so alone." The shouting had broken something, or perhaps it was her mother's tears. Ace burst into racking sobs and buried her head in Audrey's shoulder. "Mum, oh, Mum, make it all okay again." "Hush, hush." Audrey smoothed Ace's hair with her hand. "I'm not just a ghost, am I? Julian remembered me like this, because he used to come and visit me when you weren't there. He told me he was gay. I understood. My mum had known a few that way. In the Navy. They were always so brave, she said. One night I drank a little too much gin, and she came round and found me crying. I told him how I couldn't talk to you, and how much I loved you. I asked him to tell you, and he wouldn't, because he said I had to, and I never did. I never did." Ace looked up at Audrey's face, her own eyes red with tears. "You bloody well should have," she whispered. There was a noise from behind them. Ace spun round. On the other side of the room, a door was closing. Ace glimpsed Phaedrus limping away, propped up by a little old woman in black. "I wanted him to know," Ace told Audrey. "Know what it's like." Audrey pulled her daughter back to her. "He knows." They hung on to each other. After a moment, Ace stepped back, patting her mother's forearms. Despite herself, she got ashen at feeling so much with a memory of her mum. "We've got stuff to talk about, haven't we? Me and him?" "Yes, I suppose you have. Will you come back here and see me?" "Yeah," Ace nodded seriously. "Course I will, but I've got to find him first. Explain." They hugged each other, and Ace left the room. Perhaps when she did, Audrey vanished. Or perhaps she wrung her hands and went back to bed, and on some Perryvale morning woke from a dream. Perhaps she would have thought about the dream over her morning tea, how she'd heard her daughter lie and go away, how, despite this, despite everything, she'd never be able to take her courage in her hands and tell her how she felt, because in dreams there are alternatives that don't exist in waking life. The doctor walked down the steps into the basement and nodded to Benny and Christopher. Then he glanced at the pewter space console. "Ace," he muttered urgently. He strode over and knelt by her sleeping form. "I was meaning to leave this planet, take her with me, but now I must rescue her. If only I had a pewter space crown!" "Doctor." Christopher produced a wire crown and led from inside his robe. "They buried me with this. It is what you require?" "Yes!" The doctor jumped up and took the device, plugging it into the deck. "After I get her back, we must leave here, never to return." Bernice's eyebrows had reached their highest possible point. "Excuse me, but there's no time to lose," the doctor cried. "We may already be too late." And he put the crown on his head. His eyes closed. "Do you think that he is acting strangely?" Christopher asked. "Not at all," Benny sighed. "Just very badly." Across the northern continent of heaven, the meadows were alive with the dead. They scampered through the fields, running towards the summons of the stairway. In other parts of the planet, pods detached from the Hutai sphere had released stairways of their own. Everywhere, what was alive was cowering in fear from what had passed. They walked in ranks along the low stone walls and massed by settlements in the dark of night, making no sound save for the faint clicking and settling of long unused muscles. In the daylight zones, they marched together in armies, feathering outposts with clouds of spores. There were 20 of them for every living being on the planet. Operative Miller's helicopter had descended into the market square in Joycetown, and he had swiftly attempted to find his troopers. A few of them were still observing from the walls, training cameras on the stairway. Most had gone, either into town after loved ones, or simply to hide. Miller could smell it himself. The sweetness in the air was terrifying. What a cow smells in the yard of the slaughterhouse. He climbed up to the observation post on the town walls, patting a corporal on the back. "They're not going to get here in time, are they, sir?" the Ellery Corp man whispered. "The fleet, I mean." "We don't need the fleet, lad," Miller boomed heartily. "We've got the most dangerous thing in the universe on our side." "What's that, sir?" "The doctor." Miller put his binoculars up to his eyes and stared out at the sea of marching dead. A huge wave of them were halfway up the stairway now, marching to meet the Heavenites who stood at the top. Miller tried to sound convincing. "I feel sorry for the poor buggers." The doctor put a foot onto the grass of the land under the hills. He took a slow look around. There was darkness about the trees, and the sound of birdsong was muted and distant. The place was waiting. There came a distant crashing sound. Somebody was making their way clumsily through the forest. The doctor took out his fob watch and peered at it. "They're doing something, sir." The trooper handed Miller back the binoculars. The dead were raising their arms to the sky. Along them, hundreds of white spores were sprouting. "My God, they're about to release their spores. We have to get the people here inside." The trooper gazed down at the milling crowd, horror-struck. "How, sir? How the hell can we do that?" At the dig site, the travelers were crouched, weapons ready, as the rhythmic sound of shoving increased. The dead had appeared outside the dig en masse, and were slamming against the barricades, using their bodies as a battering ram. "Remember who we are," Alec muttered. "We'll all see each other again soon. And there'll be Jan there, and Rosha, and Moira." The noise stopped. There came a fluttering sound, as if something soft was being released onto the wind. "Sooner than I thought," the traveler sighed. "Blessed be." Ace was running after Phaedrus, through bracken and low bushes. She had been calling out to him, trying to get him to stop. She put a hand to her brow as she ran, trying to sort things out. Christ, what was she doing here? One minute you want to kill somebody, the next you're trying to explain, trying to get some kind of absolution. Stop! Listen, I just want to talk!" Phaedrus was blundering through the forest simulation, unsure of where he was or what he was running from. His mother had been with him for a moment, something for him to lean on. Or was that a dream? Had he found her at all? Whatever had happened, he had to keep running. Something terrible was pursuing him. If he stopped running, then... He dashed between two trees, glanced over his shoulder, and tripped into a clearing, tumbling. A dark shadow fell over him. An awful figure was standing between the priest and the sun. The doctor bent low over Phaedrus, and snapped a finger into his chin. "You," he growled, "are responsible for all that has happened here. When did the Hutai contact you?" "When I was an initiate. Many years. You called out to them.
You offered up this world for sacrifice, for your mistakes.
Yes, I did, but
Do you feel alone now? Are you afraid, Phaedrus?
the doctor's finger jabbed into the injured man's neck.
There's nobody to save you from me. And now you want to be saved. Now you've seen something you want to live for, haven't you?
The doctor grabbed the priest by the collar and snarled into his face.
Haven't you?
Yes, Mother, I...
Call your protectors! Call them!
Phaedrus blinked, trying to concentrate. His mind focused on the spore inside him, and he felt the familiar answer to his call. They'd take his pain away. They'd give him the time to see his mother again. Just a little time. The graphic of the Hutai sphere appeared over the grove, and the air turned solid once more. The doctor's face creased in pain, and he dropped Phaedrus. Ace grabbed the trees at the edge of the grove and swayed against the impact of the sound and compression. A hand clasped her shoulder, and she gasped to see Christopher, in his matrix form, beside her, his eyes closed in concentration. Ace could almost see what the two of them were concentrating on. A familiar feeling was rising about the clearing, like they were thinking of somebody she knew. She turned back to see the doctor raise his hands to his chest, the nails biting into his palms. He sucked in a deep breath and bellowed, "Aradrath!" The word echoed across the council chamber of the Hutai ship.
"What does that mean?"
one of the puffballs hissed.
"It is familiar. It is in the group mind."
A strange emotion fluttered across the mind of the Hutai consciousness. Perhaps it was some kind of elation. For the first time in centuries, the thousands of souls held captive in the group mind felt their masters falter. Beside a thin membrane, the thing that had been Jan had been watching the dead creatures march up the stairway into the belly of the sphere. The creature was swaying slightly. The tattoo of the snake, consuming its own head, was visible across the puffy layers of fungus. The being was mindless, of course, but its eyeless head was turned to the world below, and its stumpy hands were raised in some half-formed emotion. And then it remembered. For a brief second, it was pulled out of the group mind. It was an individual. He was important. Special. Time to repay the debt, Christopher told him.
Change the world,
the doctor cried. They were talking to him through the pewter space link in his fungoid neck, through the Hutai consciousness itself, and through an ancient friendship as yet left unsettled. Jen remembered heaven, and the travelers, and his love for Ace. He remembered that his secret name was Aradrath.
"Aradrath,"
the doctor said to Jan.
"Make fire."
So he did. The first small blast took the Hutai by surprise.
"What has happened?"
one hissed.
"We have been..."
The Hutai sphere exploded. The fireball erupted across the sky, blasted in the roofs, and toppled the towers of Joycetown, sent the dead flying from the stairway, which buckled and folded and burst into fragments of bone and flying cinders. The blast scorched walls and set timbers alight, and threw troopers from their platforms. It set afire clothes and burst eardrums, echoing across the valley, thundering between the hillsides. When the dead fell into the square, they were just dead. Poor corpses, with nothing alive still about them. A fine gray powder was all that showed what they had been part of. The debris crashed down on the town. Bones and bones, a collapsing rain of animal leftovers. Scapulae bounced off the tiles, and knuckles clattered into the gutters. A hard shower of joints and femurs shattered down across the landscape. The heat cloud rose in a mushroom of roaring mist, water beginning to condense and spatter down onto the fires that had sprung up everywhere. James Miller took a hand away from his blackened face and yelled up at the sky. "We're alive! We're alive!" All across heaven, the Hutai pods had toppled and swayed, with no mind left to control them. Some of them crashed into mountains, some lumbered into the earth. A few spontaneously exploded. Whatever happened, bodies fell from the stairways, no longer animated. Thousands of skeletons and corpses plummeted from the sky, or rolled back down into the lifeless heaps that had fallen all around the pods. At the dig site, Alex stuck his head out between the barricades. Across the meadow lay 100 bodies. Some of them were piled, leaning, on the planks that had shielded the travelers from attack. One had its bony hand stuck through a tiny gap. All were covered in a fine dust. Alec threw aside the timbers and stepped out into the sunlight. He fell to his knees amongst the bodies, and soon he was joined by the rest of the travelers, who kissed the ground, held each other, and sobbed in relief. They were alive.